Hello, welcome to my studio. Today I'm going to teach how to paint for absolute beginners. That is someone who has never even picked up a paintbrush. Maybe you've never even looked at paints and you just feel inspired to learn. And even if you have painted and you want to just see the absolute beginner basics of how to paint, this is going to be a great video for you. I'm going to go over materials and setup. I'm going to do an absolute beginner color theory lesson that's really bite-sized. And then finally, of course, we're going to tie it all together and make a painting. We're painting from life. I'm going to try to run through it and make this as beginner friendly, as approachable as humanly possible. So if that sounds interesting, let's just jump into the video. So first I want to start by saying we are learning in acrylic paint. A lot of these lessons and techniques are going to be applicable to any medium that is opaque and layerable. If you're painting with gouache or oil, there's going to be a ton of things that you can learn from this. There are differences. For example, if you're painting with oil, the dry time is going to be quite a bit longer. Acrylic was the first medium I ever learned in, and so it has a real soft spot in my heart, but I feel like acrylic is a really good medium for beginners. The way that I paint is very opaque and layered. And the benefit of that to a very beginner painter is that you don't have to have it perfect right out of the gate. Within the context of even your very first painting, because you can layer, you might have 2 or 3 versions of that painting where you didn't quite get it, but you learned from your mistake and then you layered on top of it. And by the end of that painting, you can walk away with something that you're really proud of. One of the ways I like to think about it is you as the artist are the medium, and it's more, especially when you're learning, about shaping yourself and like carving away at yourself and getting better at looking and seeing. The goal for a painting is not to make a perfect image. The goal is really to improve and get better. Let's just jump into the materials. Like I said, we're painting with acrylics. As I go through each thing that you will need to paint, I'm going to go from the most important thing all the way to the least important thing, and even things that you could technically go without. The thing about painting is there's a ton of tools you can use. If you've walked into an art supply store, you know this. The painting aisles are chocked full of all kinds of stuff, and it can look really intimidating. Do I need a medium? What kind of palette do I need? Do I need an easel? You pretty much just need paint, paintbrush, a surface to mix on, and a surface to paint on. And that's it. There are other things. I'm going to include my most basic setup, but know that if you can get those things, you can paint. All right, let's talk about our paint. I really recommend spending your money and your resources on getting higher quality paints and even just a few colors. Like even within this palette, you could technically get away with just these tubes of paints. If you've been to the art store, you know that they can be a little bit pricey. The thing I always tell my students is that when you have the low quality, like the little craft acrylic paints, it's not that they're bad necessarily, it's just that it feels like a different medium. Lower quality acrylic paints are gonna dry a little bit gummier, they're just gonna be a little less opaque, and the color can be less chromatic. And the reason those things are important is those things let you do a lot of layering and build up a richer palette, which I think is really important, because for me, color is the most important aspect of painting. It's debatable, but that's my opinion.
That's my opinion!
And so you want to invest in a really good palette. As you can tell, I really like Golden and Liquitex. Even the Artist Loft, which is like I think the Michaels brand professional series, is pretty good. After I finish talking about paints, I promise everything else you can kind of get away with like a cheaper version and do okay with. But I would really highly recommend getting the nicer quality paints. As far as which colors, I like to think of it as like I have a warm light and a cool red, a warm red, and then a warm blue and a cool blue. All you need is one of each of the primaries. The primary is a color that you can't mix to get that color. I'll show you when we get to color theory how much you can mix with this, but this is a good starting palette. And a quick note, I will make sure to include all of this written out in blog form in the show note link below if you want to check that out, if it's easier for you to just read these out. The next thing I'm going to talk about is your brushes. If you, again, have ever gone to an art supply store, you know that there's so many different kinds of brushes, from the pointy little pencil brushes up to the big flat brushes and filberts and like all of those different kinds of brushes. The way that I like to paint, layering in, blocking in, if you like that painterly look, if you like the way my paintings look, if that's the approach that you want, then flats and brights are going to be your go-to. Flats and brights are very similar. A flat is going to be a little longer, more rectangular, and a bright right is going to be more of a square. This is high control, and there actually is quite a bit you can do as far as mark making with these. I find that new painters often gravitate towards a brush like this so that they can lean into that hand-eye coordination that they built up in drawing. The trick though is in painting, you're kind of developing a whole different set of muscles, and as tempting as it is to go in and sketch and draw and fill in and color like the way we have since we've held a crayon, I am going to recommend that you put down your little tiny brush and you opt for a bigger brush, because this is going to help you to build up a different skill that is more like painting. Painting and drawing, there's overlap, but at the end of the day, they're two totally separate skills. And if your brushes allow you to make big painterly marks, it's gonna speed up your ability to develop that skill set. In fact, I have been known in my workshops to go around with a house painting brush, a 2, 3, 4 incher, and have my students work with that. So really, if your brush feels a little bit too big to be comfortable, that's probably about the size you need. So we just went over size and shape. As far as how many you need, I would say that you maybe only need 2. In this case, if you're painting on a scale similar to what I'm painting with, having a 12 and a 4, brushes always have a size, the name of it, in this case a flat, and then the brand on it. See if you can find something between a 12 and a 4. Definitely don't go smaller than a 4 in this case, especially if you're new, but just however many of these you want. I'm gonna have all these brushes on hand. There's a chance I may just use like 1 or 2, honestly. As far as what surface we want to paint on, I am a big fan of painting on paper when you're a student. A lot of times you can get canvases pretty cheap, and if you feel comfortable painting on that, if you would prefer to paint on that, by all means do that. But I think paper is great for a couple of reasons. 1, it doesn't take up very much space, and 2, I find that there's something psychologically helpful about painting on something as temporary feeling as paper. It feels temporary because we've been conditioned to know that like you have a whole sheet of paper, you can go through it, right? The thing is, these companies put a lot of love and effort into these papers. In this case, this is an oil and acrylic paper. So it's gonna be pretty resistant to water, which is great if you're painting in acrylic, and it holds up, and usually it's archival. Archival just means, will this painting hold up over years and years and years? For students, I don't think it's the end of the world to have something that's not archival, but it's up to everyone and their own personal sort of how they choose to value their art. This is a cheaper, more affordable option, certainly than buying canvases or panels. I will say, if this price point still feels too much and you are not worried about archival quality, something that you can do is get a tube of gesso and some cardboard. Cardboard has acid, so it's not archival, but if you don't care about that, you can just gesso over cardboard. It's nice and firm, and you can paint on that. I have been known to do that in my life, and I go to a live painting group, and lots of other artists who are just practicing will do that. So I'm just gonna go ahead and say the safest option is gonna be a pad of paper like this. For the sake of this tutorial, I have divided it into quadrants. We're gonna use each one for something different. By dividing it into quadrants, if you mess up, it just feels less scary than like ruining a whole piece of paper or like ruining a whole canvas. And there's something about this layout that just feels like I'm a student, I'm studying, I'm doing homework, versus having like a whole canvas or a panel. If that isn't something that you struggle with, do whatever. For the sake of this course and for the sake of that like anxiety that a lot of new painters have, I would recommend dividing it into quadrants. Now let's talk about our palettes. At this point, we're getting into the area of do whatever works and is accessible for you. I would recommend something like a palette paper or investing in a glass palette. You can also just go to a thrift store and find one of those photo frames with a thicker piece of glass, and you can tape off the edges so they're not sharp and use that. If you use a piece of glass, it's reusable because you can just scrape off the paint. Acrylic paint will dry and it becomes easy to kind of scrape off. You can also use paper plates. The thing I would be aware of is that there is water in acrylic paint, and that water is going to tear down your paper plate. So I would at least find something that has sort of a wax or a plastic seal on it, which is why the palette paper is so great, because one side does have that like waxy sort of finish to it that's water resistant. If you want to up level a little bit, something that I see in my workshops that really holds students back is not wanting to waste their precious paint. And I get this. Paint is expensive. I don't know about you guys, but especially in the beginning when I started painting, I would like do the math of how much each one of those wasted piles were. And so I understand not wanting to waste paint, but I will say it is important to have decently sized little puddles of paint. So I'm going to show you guys the Masterson Stay Wet palette. This is great. They have multiple sizes. As a beginner, the little size is totally fine. And the way this works is not only does it have a seal that's gonna help your paint last a lot longer, but it also has a sponge at the bottom. Excuse mine, it's very grungy. I've had this for a while. And you want to get this wet with water and vinegar. I do like a 1 part vinegar to 10 part water sort of mix. And then I soak my sponge and then I drip out the rest of it into the sink. And then I put a piece of palette paper on top of it. Because of this will stay really moist. And there's honestly a chance, if you're really careful, that you can sort of have your paints last for close to a week. The way I normally have it set up is I put my paints on here and I sort of mix on here. I do recommend having some consistency in your layout, and I think most importantly, consistency in your layout when it comes to your palette. You don't have to do this the exact way I do, it just needs to make sense for you. But what I typically do is I lay out my white. I have titanium white. It's important that you use titanium white because it's a very opaque white. Be careful not to get mixing white or zinc white because they are less opaque. And because we have a lot of transparent colors, it's just really important that you have a titanium white. So I use the most white out of all the colors. I like to lay it out in a bit of a tube. The reason for that being, if I'm mixing white into blue, I don't want to contaminate it in a spot that I'm mixing white into yellow. Think of it like having a yellow marker. Anytime you take your yellow marker over like a black line or a pencil line, it turns green and it kind of never comes back. It's not super important in the beginning, I promise, but it's just a good habit to sort of get into. And at that point, I'm just going to go through the color wheel, sort of. I like having white next to yellow because they contaminate each other a little bit less than other colors. But I have seen so many different artists put this out in so many different ways. There's really no right or wrong. It's just different approaches. Another approach that a lot of people do when it comes to their palette is they just have a warm and cool of each color. I kind of have that, except for I like to think of it as like I have a warm light and a cool light, a cool red, a warm red, and then a warm blue and a cool blue. So this is my layout. If I have a bigger palette, that is to say I have more colors on here, I will just curve this way. I mix a little bit on here, but I predominantly mix on here. Here's some tips for when you lay out your little puddles of paint. Go larger than you think. If you do a small puddle, especially if you don't have a stay wet palette, it's gonna dry really quickly, almost instantly, especially if you're in a warm climate or you're in a room where a heater's going, they're gonna dry really fast. So I recommend bigger puddles. I also recommend having them touch if you don't have a stay wet palette, because where they're touching, it's gonna stay nice and hydrated. The only thing is obviously it becomes more contaminated, but if you don't have a stay wet palette, make sure your blobs are bigger and make sure that they're touching a little bit. Another really helpful tool is a continuous spray mist bottle. You can get these fairly inexpensively. These are great because you are gonna wanna keep your paints sort of misted just a little bit. You don't wanna oversaturate it with water, but this is really helpful. You'll see me use it. Before painting sort of switches over to like second nature, which I promise eventually it will, you're gonna be doing a lot of like staring and thinking and math, and like I think of that like spinning computer loading icon. And wanting to keep your paints from drying out, you can mist this kind of while you're processing, and it can help your paints, again, last longer, which is really important. Continuing talking about water, you'll also need some kind of a container for water for cleaning out your brushes. You can just use like an old spaghetti jar and maybe cut out a piece of sponge and put it at the bottom. You just need something to hold water, and you need something to agitate your bristles so that the pigment can fall out and your brush can get cleaned. A lot of these buckets that are specialty made for painters have little ridges at the bottom. This one comes with a nice little spot to rest your brushes on. You don't need something this fancy. A spaghetti jar with a sponge at the bottom will work just fine. Another thing you'll need is rags. So this can be anything from paper towels to kitchen rags to what I actually really like to use is old clothes that like are too ragged to donate. I will cut them up into square-ish shapes and use those in my studio, because once they have been coated in paint, they become crusty and not usable. So make sure whatever you're using with your paint is no longer going to be used again, and especially in like a food setting. So it's kitchen towel that is retired from the kitchen, basically. Acrylic paint is widely thought to be pretty safe. You don't want to drink, obviously, the paint water, and you don't want to sand it and breathe it in. Outside of that, it is generally considered safe. However, there is a debate in the painting community about how safe it is. And so just out of abundance of caution, if you are someone who knows you're gonna get paint all over you, maybe wear gloves, maybe wear something to protect your arms, find some scraps of paper, protect your space. If you don't want to get your clothes ruined, you can get an apron, you can put on an old t-shirt, but just be aware that protecting your space is another aspect that you'll want to consider. And then finally, what are we painting? Our reference photo, our object. I really emphasize learning to paint from life, so having something set up in front of you. I have a Honeycrisp apple that I'm gonna paint for this, and I also have one of these little lights. I got this one from Harbor Freight for pretty inexpensive. I recommend having light on whatever you're painting because it helps you to organize your shapes and your surfaces. You could also go online and look for royalty-free images. I recommend finding something simple, something like an apple, something like an orange, a ball, a mug, something that doesn't have compound intersecting shapes. If you are someone who you won't be motivated to paint an apple or an orange, you have to paint something that you're uniquely interested in. By all means, paint what's interesting to you. I'm recommending something simple because you're not just developing the ability to sort of render with your hands, you're also developing the ability to look, and they're both challenging. Pair them together and it is a tall order. Choose something that's interesting but also respects your newness at the same time. That's gonna look different for everyone. Today I'm painting an apple. If you just wanna paint what I'm painting, that's totally fine. I will have exactly what I'm looking at as a downloadable image for you to look at. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this video out. I'm going to mist my paints a little bit. You want to be careful not to mist these too much because they'll start to break down and sort of get liquidy. I'm going to go ahead and seal my palette, and then this honestly would be good for another day or two. That is an overview of the materials list. I know it was a lot, but I went through and kind of made it a really intentional point to talk through why we choose what we choose. Sometimes whenever you sign up for a class, I know certainly for me when I went to college and I got this huge materials list, I really wanted to know, well, what do I need to buy and what's the importance? So that's what I was trying to stress with this video. In the next video, we're going to be using a little bit of color theory. We're gonna make a color wheel and we're gonna talk about how to hold a paintbrush and how to mix paint. After that, we're gonna put it all together and make a painting. So stay tuned for those videos.